Welcome back to EDIT 640. This is Joe once again, and I'm excited to present to you this second content module in our course on camera operation. In this module, we will review some recent trends in video camera technology, as well as take a look at some of the basic functionalities that are relevant to the instructional production process. Then we'll start wish listing as we review some of the many accessories that we can purchase or even fabricate for the cameras that are on our smartphones. And finally, we will explore several strategies for managing media, for managing the various video, audio, and graphic resources that we use throughout the production process. So let's begin by taking a look at a couple trends. And there are three that I want to focus on. The movement to tapeless recording, the movement to smartphone devices, as well as the use of SLR cameras. So let's start off talking about tapeless. As you know, back in the day, most of the recording was done on videotape, and the videotapes varied in size. All of that has changed now as cameras have gotten smaller and the recording process has gone digital. We now no longer need to use tape to record the images that come through our camera. It all goes to digital media cards that are either built into the actual device or they're exported or transferred via portable media like SD cards, and we'll take a look at some examples of that shortly. Another really important trend is the movement to smartphones. I'll bet most of you have an Android or an iOS based smartphone right now. I doubt many of you have a phone like I do. I have a Windows phone, one of the few people that has a Windows 8 phone. I really like it, by the way, but there's no denying that Android and iOS absolutely dominate the mobile operating system industry. Nevertheless, why it matters to us is that we end up using our smartphones now to shoot a lot of productions. When I say we, I mean teachers. We no longer have separate devices, or at least very few of us have separate devices that we use for capturing photos, for capturing videos. Everything seems to be migrating toward the use of the smartphone as the media capture device. And that's significant. And as we'll see here, there are lots of accessories that can be purchased for these handheld devices. And these devices have specific purposes, and I'll tell you about those in just a minute. I'll bet a few of you have a really nice photo camera. Some of the newer SLR cameras also have the ability to capture video. And the reason this is significant is that the frame rates and the quality of the optics in these cameras are so superior to what you get in your phone. Many of them rival professional level video production cameras. And as a result, you'll see a lot of instructional productions and even professional productions now that use standard SLR cameras simply because the optics in them produce such good quality. And this is a trend that we need to be aware of. I'll bet some of you have a camera and you may not have even yet experimented with the video in it. I would encourage you to try it, because the HD video capabilities are far superior than anything we're going to get out of our cell phones. And this will be relevant as we work on our productions later on. Some of the basic functionalities that are relevant to the camcording experience. Well, I have several here that I want to review here, and obviously we're looking at a very fancy camera here. Nobody's expected to have access to something like this. But the simple point that I want to make here is that many of the high-end functionalities are also available using simple consumer smartphones. And this is a very recent trend, and it's one that we need to pay attention to. First, I want to talk about exposure. Most of you have a pretty good understanding what this means. Ultimately, we're talking about differences in aperture diameter, and you can see the different f-stop levels here, and you don't necessarily need to know too much about that, but all I care for you to understand right now, for those of you who have not taken a photography class before, is that as you start up on the top left-hand side at f2.8, you can see how big that hole is in the aperture. This allows a lot of light to come in, which would logically then make that light that image very exposed. Contrast that all the way to the bottom right at f22, you have very little light coming in, and this would potentially have a tendency to underexpose, just depending on the type of source material that you have. It can also be used for depth of field. Later on we'll talk about that in just a minute. But here's some examples. Clearly the one on the left is underexposed and the one on the right has this bleached out effect that comes from too much light penetrating through the aperture. So the point is, many of these smartphones and the apps that you use to capture video actually have exposure settings. So if you have not yet explored them on your smartphone, you need to do so, because as you can see in the middle image, when we correctly expose this, that's the optimal target that we're trying to achieve here. So please take the time to experiment with some of the exposure settings on your smartphone cameras. And likewise, please note that especially for iPhone, there are so many different video recording apps that are out there. You don't necessarily have to use the default one that's pre-installed in iOS. So search the App Store and take a look at some of the others that are available. Many are there for free, and we'll have some recommendations on this that I'll post later in the discussion forum. And likewise, if any of you are using apps that you really like, please share that in the discussion forum. All right, let's talk about fill lighting. And this obviously relates to exposure as well. You can see here, this is a classic dilemma that we face with still photography, and it certainly transfers over to video production as well. You have a subject that's facing away from the light source. It's very bright in the background, but they're facing away from it. You want to shoot them, but the problem is there's so much light in the background that the camera, if it's set to auto exposure, probably doesn't capture a very well exposed image. So what do? Well, obviously this is where some fill lighting can come in. Now if we had a photo camera and we were shooting this, we would simply turn on our flash and back away a couple feet. Might take a couple shots to get it right, but that fill flash would then illuminate the subject enough to make it look really good while not bleaching out the background too much. For video cameras, this is a lot more challenging. Obviously we can't turn the flash on the entire time unless your camera or your app has that functionality. So again, you'll need to explore the capabilities of backlighting, or excuse me, fill lighting, to help the exposure of subjects that are in front of strongly lit backgrounds. So take a look again at the capabilities of your smartphone app if you're using that. If you have an SLR camera, this will be very easy. If you have built-in flash, all SLR cameras will have that functionality. So check the literature for your camera and experiment with that in case you ever need to shoot something like this with a light background and a subject facing the camera away from that light background. Let's talk about lenses. There are lots of lenses obviously, but we're going to focus on two right now and start off talking about wide angle lenses. If you take a look at the image of the face here, this mannequin in the top left hand side, you'll see that the camera is very close, and as we progress to the right all the way over, the camera starts backing up and backing up very gradually until the bottom right hand side. You can see that we've got a much wider angle here, simply meaning that we can capture a lot more of the image from the same position of the camera. For those of you who have a GoPro or any other type of mobile camera that has a fisheye lens to it, the angle on those cameras are so wide, the lenses that they use, you have to get the camera very close to the subject to get a good shot. And when you take landscape shots, for example, everything has kind of this bowl feeling to it, and that's a result of having super wide angle lenses. Contrast that with telephoto lenses. And many of you with SLR cameras probably have telephoto lenses that allow you to capture not just a large image, but give you the ability to zoom in and capture a much tighter frame of that particular shot, like what we see here in red. So wide angle lenses, telephoto lenses, these are examples, but what I want to emphasize here is that, and this may surprise many of you probably just use the pinch to zoom in or zoom out function on your smartphone to help get your images framed. Well, believe it or not, there is an entire aftermarket of add-on products that are available for your smartphones. Not just the iOS, Android has many different types of add-on products, and lenses are probably the most common. Lenses and the Steadicam devices, which we'll talk about here in a second. And you can see here, like the one on the left here, some of them are actual multi-lens with this little rotary dial. Prices for these vary. They're certainly not free, so this is an added expense. But the simple point is that a lot of quasi-professional productions now are shot in HD using these add-on lenses. And I say quasi, when I say quasi, I'm referring really to professional level web production. We're not talking about professional broadcast. Obviously, that takes camera equipment that is well beyond the price reach of teachers, and certainly for people like myself as well. Even though I have access to some of the stuff in media services, what we have access to here in our college is very limited. And the optics that are in these add-on lenses are almost as good as the prosumer level cameras that we've got running here in our studio. And so I want to encourage you to consider, if this type of production is something that interests you, I want you to consider shopping for add-on lenses. You don't need them, but I have a suspicion that many of you will want them. And many of these lenses are very, very cheap. You can go to Amazon or Google and punch in iPhone lens or Android lens, and you'll see all different kinds of options available to you. Many of them have filters on them as well. It's a pretty rich aftermarket now. Let's talk about depth of field. Depth of field is the distance between the nearest and farthest objects that are in focus. And you've seen this technique a lot on TV. For example, in this particular photo right here, there's a very broad depth of field here where we've got the boat as well as that background hill still remain in focus. But how many times have you seen this? Have you seen a close-up of an object where the background is blurred? Well, this is a trick that's done with depth of field. We see this in video when we want to emphasize one actor or one subject over another. For example, in this opening shot, you can see the actor and the actress in the background opens the door, she's in focus, and then the very next frame focuses, as the door shuts, focuses on her. So there's actually some dialogue that takes place between these two people. But the point is, you can emphasize the subject by changing the depth of field with the camera in the exact same position. So again, I urge you, take a look at the literature for your cameras, or look at the smartphone or the apps that you're using and see if there is a depth of field option. And this will be something that you may want to experiment with later on in your productions. As you can see here in this slide, the depth of field is adjusted by the focal length of the lens, as well as the aperture setting. And you can see when you have a very wide aperture, such as an f2, you can see that it results in a very shallow depth of field. Whereas if you close down the aperture to an f16 down at the bottom, you end up getting a much broader depth of field. Let's talk about white balance. This is one of those tricks that a lot of amateur photographers don't take the time to do. Many of the SLR cameras, as well as even some of the smartphone apps now, have a white balance option. And I want to explain what this does. The purpose of white balancing is to remove the inaccurate color casting. Have you ever taken a photo of somebody and they end up looking purple or pink? This is a result of white balance issues, and it has to do with differences in the temperature of the light source. One of the simplest ways you can calibrate your camera or your smartphone so that it knows what white really is to hold up something white in the frame, like this guy is here with this poster board. You then focus the camera on it and click the white balance option, and that trains the camera to understand that that is the temperature of white, so that it will then adjust all of the other colors, the flesh tones and background colors, etc., based on this new point of origin, this new white color. And so you end up avoiding what you see here in the middle with this 400 and 4500 degree color balance issue, color temperature issue, where he's pinked out right in the middle. You have much more neutral tones up at the top when you raise the temperature a little bit. And this is done simply by white balancing. So again, take a look at your camera, take a look at your smartphone app, and see if it has the ability to do white balancing. Let's talk about microphones. There's no quicker way to ruin an instructional production than by having poor audio. So how do we make our audio better? Well, there are two different types of microphones that can work with most cameras. The one that's built in, and I'll give you a hint, we rarely want to use the built-in camera microphone, or an external microphone. There are many different kinds of external microphones. The boom mic is the one that we see on most set-based productions. Occasionally you'll see a mobile production that uses it, but for the most part these are more for stationary shoots. And you see that big fuzzy thing on top of the microphone? This sock is what helps deplete wind noise or other ambient noise, and it's really important that all external microphones have some type of windsock on them. Shotgun mics you see a lot at live events where action audio, on-site audio, environmental audio is important, and it looks like a gun and it's attached right to the top of the camera. For a lot of our needs, instructional videos make use of lavalier mics, and thankfully lavalier mics are really cheap these days, and lavalier mics will plug into all smartphones. And you can see here, if you look right here where I'm wiggling the mouse, you'll see that even it, as small as it is, has a windsock on it, and it's there so that it obviously depletes that wind noise. And finally, of course, the venerable handheld, which has been around for decades. Certainly the handheld is very important. We tend to see that more in live productions where you have multiple subjects and the host is moving the microphone in front of the correct person when they're speaking. We see this a lot in interviews. So what does this mean to you? Well, it means that you want to consider, I know nobody wants to spend more money, but you need to consider spending a few dollars to get an audio adapter for your camera, whether it's your smartphone or a photo camera or an SLR. I urge you to figure out a way, maybe just borrow this, but to find a way to get access to an external microphone. Your video productions will sound much more professional. I promise you there is no quicker way to sound like an amateur than to record a production using the built-in microphones. Very, very rarely do they produce the quality that you need for a professional instructional production, and that's what we're after. So please consider shopping around for a lavalier microphone if you need one, or an external microphone if you need one. They're very cheap, and you only need the mini audio version, this little cable here that plugs directly into your smartphone. And then of course don't forget your little foam sock. Most of them come with a foam sock on them, and in many cases you can improve that further. If it's really windy for an outdoor shot, you can even cut up a real sock and put on top of that. That's where it gets its name, kind of a low budget version, and that will work as well. So please find access to an external microphone. How in the world do you keep a little phone steady? Seriously, if we're shooting all this video from these tiny cameras that are built into our smartphones, how do you hold your hand steady? Well, there are expensive options like this Steadicam device that we see here that are beyond the budgetary needs of most teachers, $160, $170. So I certainly don't expect you to buy something like that. But there are homegrown and fabricated tools that you can use to keep your camera steady. The one you see on the left here is just some cheap metal piping. I think this guy spent like $10 making this, and if you search YouTube you'll see hundreds of videos that will demonstrate how to make homegrown Steadicam holding devices. The bottom line is handheld cameras are very difficult to hold still, and as a result you're going to need a way to hold it still when you're shooting. Holding it freehand is not going to be sufficient. There are lots of cheap ways to make a Steadicam device, and you're looking at one here, but Google or search YouTube and you'll see many, many more that will stimulate your creativity. For most of you, a simple tripod will accommodate most of your needs. But for those of you who have dolly shots or moving shots or other shots in the field where the camera has to move with the subject, you may want to look at getting a Steadicam. But for the rest of us, tripods are going to be essential, and this is why a tripod is required in the course. Most of you have access to a tripod, but what you may not have access to is the adapter to hold your smartphone. So again, if you search Amazon and search Google, you'll see that there are lots of really cheap adapters that you can get, these little cradle devices that will hold your camera steady, your smartphone steady, while it's screwed into the top of a tripod. So please make sure that you find access to that. You can also, do the ultra cheap tripod mount with duct tape and clothes hangers and who knows what else. You could probably fabricate something, but the bottom line is, $10 on an adapter is probably going to save you a lot of headache later on. Also note that tripods are not always just the stiff three-legged pieces of aluminum that we're used to. If you look up here in the top right hand side, you'll see the GorillaPod, and there are plenty of knockoff versions that are much cheaper. Those are very practical when you need to mount the camera to something that's not very stable or is not very flat that a regular tripod would require. You also see this a lot with the GoPro cameras. Lots of accessories for them, such as suction cups and helmet mounts, etc. So again, this is all going to depend on the kind of production that you're shooting. But the bottom line is you need to plan now on how you want to fabricate or acquire something that's going to help you keep your cameras from wobbling around to get those wobbly shots, because those will not be tolerated in a professional level production. Let's talk about managing media. So these cameras that we have that are in our smartphones or in our cameras themselves are still photo cameras. So whatever we're using, we've got them steadied and we have all these accessories now. We're ready to go out and shoot. So we go capture a bunch of stuff. What do we do with that? How do we transfer the files off the camera? Where do we store it? And what kind of backup or copy strategy do we have? That's what I want to talk about now. Let's talk first about file transfer. USB cables typically accommodate most of the camera devices that you're going to use to capture footage for your productions. Some of you may have cameras that have an SD card or a micro SD card, and you might have a reader device on your computer or a little attached device that connects via USB. Those can be very, very practical. You shoot it in your camera, you pop the chip out, you pop it in your computer, and you can then copy it directly onto the hard drive for editing. Some of you may even have cameras that are capable of transmitting files via Bluetooth. I don't typically recommend this because, as convenient as Bluetooth is, it's incredibly slow with the data rates for transferring video. So you might experiment with that, but I doubt you're going to have data rates that you're going to tolerate. But you can be the judge of that. Same goes for Wi-Fi. Many of the cameras and smartphones are obviously Wi-Fi enabled, and if they're on the same network, it is possible to transfer video directly through the Wi-Fi network to your computer for editing. But again, the data rates will be probably pretty slow, much slower than a direct connection via USB or SD card, and your patience will probably wear thin. But again, you can be the judge, experiment, and make your decisions accordingly. Let's talk about storage. Okay, so if we get the files off our camera, what do we do with them? How do we create a storage schema that is accessible to us later on so that we can actually find the stuff that we shot in an efficient way? Well, there are two different schools of thought on this, and this transcends upwards into professional productions at the Hollywood level. How do you take the footage and organize all that footage so you can find it later in the editing bay, especially when in large productions you've got other people that are serving as editors? Well, one way to do it is to set up a concept schema where you've got the footage organized by media type: video, audio, and graphics. So you create a master folder called project. You then create 3 subfolders inside that project folder, one for video, one for audio, one for graphics. And after you shoot your footage or capture your footage or create your footage or download your footage, you put it in the correct appropriate folder, and then you can import that directly into the timeline using Adobe Premiere, Elements, or whatever your video editor is. Another option, and we see this again on basic productions all the way up to Hollywood, is to have everything grouped by scene. And we see this a lot in narrative-based productions, especially in the Hollywood level productions. You'll have everything organized by scene and even by shoot. And so there may be subfolders within subfolders here, but this is just another option. You might have a master project folder and then scene 1, 2, and 3, and inside scene 1 you might have video, audio, and graphics. It just depends on the scale of the production. But these are two different storage schemas. You have the media type, and then you have by scene. So consider both of those. Certainly not going to advocate one or the other, but those are some of the more common options. The most important thing to remember is get organized. Make that root project folder, and inside it put some subfolders to keep everything arranged in a manner that will help you find them later. Now, worst case scenario, you shoot all this stuff and you lose it. What do? What's your backup strategy? Well, let me show you what the pros do. And we read about this in our readings for this week, but essentially you have 3 copies, the first of which is your master. You never touch your master. The master file is exactly that. It is the preserved raw resource footage that is available to you in case disaster strikes and you need a backup. So the master file remains untouched and it stays on your storage volume separate from everything else. The second type of file type that we tend to use for copies is the working copy. And the working copy is exactly what it sounds. This is the one that you edit. This is what you'll import into the timeline. In other words, you make a duplicate of the master, and the working copy is the one that you'll then import. You do not import the master into Premiere Elements. You literally duplicate the master file and then take the working copy and import that one into Premiere Elements. Many people will take that working copy and they'll put that in the project folder. So they have 2 different folders. They'll have a backup folder or a master folder and then a project folder. And the project folder is the one that contains the working copy. The Final Cut is, again, exactly what it sounds like. This is after you've finished all of your edits and you're exporting all of those changes to the working copy, assembling and compositing all of those edit decisions that you made are now exported into a single file format that we call the Final Cut. And this is the one that's ready to be distributed. So master copy, working copy, and Final Cut. Those are the big 3. So that concludes Module 2 on camera operation. Don't forget to check the main course site for more information about the homework assignment. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.